Thank you very much indeed, Gareth, for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to come along here this evening. And thank you to all of you for taking the time to come along to this talk on science and faith. This is, I think, for me this has been a really important topic. It's something that I've been interested in basically all of my adult life. About the nature of science, how science works. I mean, science is an incredible achievement, if that's the right word to use, of humanity. Something that has developed for hundreds of years and has helped us to make so much sense of the world around us. And so, thinking back to when I was a child, thinking about getting into astronomy and things like that, just fascinated by how science worked. But also, as a Christian, thinking about the nature of my faith. And so, Christianity on the one hand, my science on the other, going to university, and then beginning to think, well, how do they relate to each other? And of course the perception was that there might be some sort of tension or conflict between them. So this was something I started to explore. And I suppose what I'm talking about tonight is really an attempt to sort of summarise that journey and summarise my thinking about it. And when we look at how science has developed over those hundreds of years, how much it has made sense of the world, and how it's continually changing, so that most recently, when we think of the Nobel Prizes that have been won, now machine learning is playing a huge role in all of this as well. So AI and machine learning is another aspect of this whole discussion about science and faith. It's not my topic for tonight, but there's a lot of really interesting ways in which science and belief in God intersect. But the question that I want to explore tonight is whether science has explained God away. And so what I would like to do is try to think about the narrative of a conflict between the two. And I suppose again this is maybe thinking about my own thoughts on this, the perception that there was a conflict between them, and trying to make sense of what that even means. In what way could they be in conflict? So I want to try to spell that out. First of all, though, the very idea that there is a conflict is very much disputed. Sam Harris, an American neuroscientist, wrote the following. He said that the truth, however, is that the conflict between religion and science is unavoidable. The success of science often comes at the expense of religious dogma. The maintenance of religious dogma always comes at the expense of science. Always. It's inevitable. This conflict is always present. But let's take another view. This is from the late Colin Russell, a very eminent historian of science. And he wrote the following. The common belief that the actual relations between religion and science over the past few centuries have been marked by deep and enduring hostility is not only historically inaccurate, but actually a caricature so grotesque that what needs to be explained is how it could possibly have achieved any degree of respectability. Well, there's a conflict here between these two viewpoints, that's for sure, but is there a conflict between science and belief in God? And so that's really what I want to explore. So to give you a sort of quick sense of where I'm going with this, I want to first of all think about the terminology, because the title that I've chosen tonight is very deliberate, about explaining away. So I want to introduce that idea and then think about how that might apply in the context of science and God. So most of the talk is going to be about science and God. Really then trying to figure out whether science does explain God away or not. Towards the end then, I'm going to explore the question of evolution. This is certainly a hot topic when it comes to thinking about science and faith, and especially science and Christian belief. And then I've mentioned that word faith, so at the end then I'm just going to briefly touch on the notion of faith. Now, some of the work that I'm describing tonight or some of the ideas are coming out of a project. In fact, 2 projects that we had at the university. I know I work in the computer science department. How were we working on projects to do with science and belief in God? That's another story. We can talk about that later if you like. So one of these was called Explaining and Explaining Away. And the idea in this project was to think about, well, how does explaining away work in general? So I'm going to say a little bit about that. And then another one that was kind of the flip side of this. So the first one's a very negative one, whether something explains something else away. The second project was what we called conjunctive explanations. It was one of my colleagues who came up with that term. The idea being that you could take 2 explanations together, and maybe together they would be better than they would be in isolation. And so whether that might apply to science and religious explanations. These projects were carried out with colleagues at the University of Utah in the States, Queen's in Belfast, and at Ulster as well. Indeed, one of my colleagues, Mark McCartney, is here tonight. He was involved in these projects. So if you spot any obvious problems in the arguments and so forth, please pick them up with Mark afterwards this evening. Okay, so let's think just for a moment about the conflict. What is the nature of the conflict? Well, it could be a logical conflict. Right? It could be that you just can't believe, if you believe one thing, you just simply cannot believe the other. We could think about this in terms maybe not just of what you believe, but about how you vote. So we think of the American elections. Logically speaking, if you vote for Trump, you can't vote for Harris, and vice versa. They're just mutually exclusive. There's no possibility of voting for them both. So, is it like that with science and God? Are they mutually exclusive? Well, they're not. And nobody thinks they are, by the way. Jerry Coyne, I don't know, many people have heard of Jerry Coyne. Jerry Coyne is a very prominent and outspoken atheist, and especially in terms of science and religious belief in the United States. He's the sort of American version of Richard Dawkins, something like that. And he wrote the following. He said that, I don't mean logical incompatibility. That's clearly wrong, for in principle there could be both science and a God to be worshipped. Now, if this scientist, who is perhaps the most outspoken critic of religious belief, thinks that in principle you could have both, well then the conflict, if there is one, must lie elsewhere. It's not a logical conflict. It's not like voting for Trump on the one hand or Harris. It must be some other kind of conflict. So what is it? Or at least what's it perceived to be? And it's the idea that science has made God unnecessary. And perhaps the clearest explanation or clearest description of this is given by the American cosmologist Sean Carroll. He wrote, over the past few hundred years, the progress of science has worked to strip away God's roles in the world. He is needed to keep things moving, or to develop the complexity of living creatures, or to account for the existence of the universe. 2,000 years ago, it was perfectly reasonable to invoke God as an explanation for natural phenomena. Now we can do much better. So I think this is how people perceive there to be a conflict. And Gareth sort of intimated that in his opening comments. As science explains more and more about the world, there's less and less need for God. God is sort of made redundant, an unnecessary hypothesis, an unnecessary explanation. Or to put it in my terminology, science has explained God away. Okay, so that's the claim we want to evaluate. So how are we going to do it? Well, we need to then think about how explaining away might work. So let's suppose you go out to go to work tomorrow, and if you drive a car, you go out to start your car, and it won't start. And if you have as much knowledge about car mechanics as I do, you won't have a clue what is likely to be the problem. So two ideas might sort of come to mind, but it's going to be very limited knowledge for me anyway. One might be that it's a flat battery. I mean, that's one thing I do know. The other is maybe that there's some problem with the starter motor, a faulty starter motor. But I have no idea which, and I wouldn't know how to check. So what I do is call my mechanic. My mechanic comes out, a couple of minutes, a couple of checks. Oh, it's a flat battery. So we've got these two possible explanations. The car won't start. We've got the faulty starter motor and the flat battery. Now, although the mechanic has just told me that it's a flat battery, I mean, it is possible that there's a faulty starter motor too, right? I mean, I could be having a really bad day. It could be that there are both of these problems. But I don't really contemplate that idea. So why not? Well, once I learn that the battery's flat, that explains everything, and the other hypothesis drops out of the picture. There's just no need for it anymore. It's redundant. Now, it could be that there is a problem. I mean, it's not absolutely ruling that out. They're not incompatible like Trump and Harris. But it's very unlikely. There's just no need to have that explanation anymore. And so this is an example where explaining away typically occurs. Okay? Not because the other one's impossible, just because it's not really needed. So sometimes explaining away occurs, but sometimes it doesn't. So here's another scenario. I used to play a bit of snooker when I was young, sort of sign of a misspent youth. And so, let's imagine that we're playing a game of snooker. And, I pull off this fantastic shot. I've deliberately hit the black to go around two cushions and into the corner pocket. And you should be impressed. So this was the skill of my playing. I intended this. It was because of my skill. And you look at me rather dismissively and say, well, I can explain what happened. The particular angle that the white was moving at, it hit the black at just the right angle to knock it onto the cushion, to go onto the other cushion, so that it would go into the pocket. There's a perfectly good physical explanation. Now, as well as seeming a bit bizarre that you're giving that kind of explanation for my shot, if you're trying to suggest that means that it had nothing to do with my skill, then I'm going to be, well, first of all, not very impressed, and secondly, it's just clearly a bad example of explaining away. Why? Well, it's not that I'm disputing your physical explanation. I mean, it's clearly right. Clearly the white hit the black at just the right angle for it to go into the pocket. But why did it do that? Well, it did it because I intended it. It did it because of the skill with which I hit the shot. And so these two explanations now go together very nicely. Now here's the point. Sometimes explaining away occurs, and sometimes it doesn't. And so the question is, which it might be in the case of science and God. Is it a case where science makes the other explanation redundant and removes God from the picture? Or is it more like the snooker scenario where the two go together? So let's just think about the first example that we had again for a moment. The one about the car. That seemed like a pretty clear example, because if it accounted for the evidence okay, there was no need for the other one. And indeed, this takes us to the project that I was talking about earlier. My colleague's here now, he wasn't in at the start, and I did point out, you can ask him any questions about anything you think is dubious in what I'm saying this evening. So what we were doing in part of that project was trying to determine, well, when does explaining away occur? What are the relevant factors which tell us when it occurs or when it doesn't? So one of them would be, well, if the two explanations, if one of them works, the other one just isn't really needed because the first one accounts for all of the evidence. If they don't depend on each other, then it may not be necessary. Whereas if they do depend on each other, if one of them requires the first one, then that might be a scenario where they both need to go together. And so there were various sort of factors like that that we started to look at. And so we saw that in the case of the snooker example, right? In the case of the snooker example, you see now, think about the physical explanation. The speed of the white ball, the angle that it was moving at, the way it hit the black, the way it went round the angles into the pocket. There was a physical explanation, okay. But why did that physical explanation work? It only worked because I hit the white ball the right way to start with. Because of the intention of doing that, okay. And so the physical explanation wouldn't really account for it going into the pocket. Now, it could just by chance, but if I start doing this regularly, you're going to have to start acknowledging that actually maybe he does have some skill, and maybe the physical explanation depends on the intention of the player. So which is it when it comes to science and God? Well, if we go back to the origins of modern science, we think of key players, people like Newton, people like Galileo, Boyle, and Kepler, and so many more who believed in God. They just didn't do science and happen to believe in God. They did science because they believed in God. And furthermore, they believed that God was behind science, just like the snooker player is behind the physical explanation for the ball going into the pocket, so they believed that God was behind science. In fact, the very idea was that the laws of science, where did these laws of science come from? Well, they came from the Creator. They believed in the laws because they believed in the lawgiver. And so rather than thinking of science and God as rival explanations, they saw them as going together. God, if you like, behind science or before science, and science depending on God. And so for these thinkers, the idea that there was a conflict, well, nothing could have been further from their minds. They simply wouldn't have thought about it in those terms at all. And they really would have been quite shocked at the idea that there was some kind of conflict. That's just not how they thought about it. So, from that point of view, when we think about science, one of the things that I would want to say here is science explains. That much everybody's agreed on, right? And we don't have to, as Christians, somehow try to argue against science and say, well, science doesn't really explain, and so we can believe in God. No, science explains all right. That's what all of these early believers in God thought. But why does science explain? Well, it explains by appealing to the laws of the natural world and things like that have been put in place by God, the laws and the processes of the natural world. So when we think of it in those terms, the conflict seems to disappear. Now, let's just press that a little bit further. Science explains, is what I'm saying. But I'm arguing that it doesn't explain away. And so what we need to be very careful with is when somebody's trying to use science against God, the idea might be that there's this move, and we need to be careful to look out for this move from science explains, which we all agree, to science explains away. And those two things are totally different. Okay, that's the gist of this. So that's the first point. When we think about science explaining it, I would argue, and these founders of modern science would have argued, that it doesn't explain away. But we can go further than that. Because actually when we start to think about science, I would suggest that science itself points to God by means of a number of findings of science and things that science tells us about the world around us. Let me start with one pointer that concerns the beginning of the universe. When we go back to the sort of late 19th century, there was no basis for believing that the universe had a beginning in terms of evidence from astronomy or evidence of that nature. It looked as if the universe had been pretty much the way it is now. It had always been like that, more or less. And so in 1917, we have Albert Einstein with his theory of general relativity. And there's something odd about his theory. It looks like it doesn't allow for the universe to be static, as they called it. It had to be either expanding or contracting, and he didn't like that idea. So he put an extra term, a fudge factor, in his equations, which he later acknowledged to be his greatest ever mistake. The reason for this was because a few years later, Edwin Hubble discovered that when you looked at distant galaxies, the light was what they called redshifted. It was, and this was because they were moving away from us. Okay. Now, it didn't take people too long to figure out that if they were moving away, then if you think of it going back in time, they would have been closer together. And ultimately, going right back to a point, to a beginning. Now, I know this idea of this happening billions of years ago, Christians will have different views. I mean, I mentioned this when I was here a few weeks ago, that Christians kind of different views on things, and never more so than on science. Well, actually, it's not true that it's only on science. It's all sorts of things, isn't it? It's about the end of the world, it's about baptism and things like this. Christians will have different views. I've even heard that Presbyterians sometimes have different views on things, but I don't know if that's true or not, but it might be. But whatever Christians might think about this and how that might relate to our interpretation of the Bible, this idea that the scientific evidence was pointing to a beginning caused even greater problems for people who didn't believe in God. And one of the reasons for this is expressed by the late Stephen Hawking, who said that people didn't like the idea that the universe had a beginning because it smacks of divine intervention. If the universe had a beginning, well, how could that happen? A universe just can't come into existence out of absolutely nothing, which is what the science seemed to be saying. So many scientists come up with alternatives to try to avoid the idea that the universe had a beginning, but as more and more evidence came in, it seemed to confirm this picture of a beginning. Now, I don't want to say that this is absolute proof. The universe, definitely, science 100% shows the universe at a beginning. There's various other ideas out there. But as they've been proposed, typically they just haven't stood up to scrutiny as more and more evidence has come in. So for example, the idea of inflation, some people have suggested that maybe would avoid the need for a beginning. But it turned out that even if you accept that, maybe that took longer, but still it would require a beginning. And so the scientific evidence still appeared to be pointing to a beginning. And so, if this is the case, this is, I think, at least a pointer to belief in God. But then there's also the order that we have in the universe. When we think of science, at whatever scale, whether it's at the macroscopic level of the universe as a whole, the large-scale structure, whether it's at the subatomic level, whether it's at the level of life, and we think about all the mechanisms of life and the structure of DNA, for example, we find order everywhere in the world. And the question is, why is the universe like that? This is the order that science describes. So you can't really say, well, science explains this order. No, the laws that science uses to describe the order just push us back to the laws. The question is, why is the world capable of being described by laws in the first place? Why is it like that? There doesn't seem to be any reason, if there's no God, to believe that the universe has to be so highly ordered. And so again, this order that science discovers everywhere seems to point to an intelligent being. It's the kind of thing we would expect if there was an intelligent creator, but we'd have no good reason to expect it if the universe was just the product of mindless chance. Now there's a further thing about this order, and it's an order that can be described in the language of mathematics. So Galileo famously said this about the universe, that the universe is written in the language of mathematics. Many of these early thinkers talked about two books, the book of Scripture and the book of Nature. And the point was that when you go to study nature, it's like you need to know the language to understand this book of nature. And according to Galileo, it's written in the language of mathematics. And so, again, whether it's at the subatomic level, whether it's at the level of the galaxies and so forth, we describe this with mathematical equations. Now some people have argued, and I think very convincingly, that this also points to an intelligent mind behind the universe. Now, and we need to work a little bit with this one. If you look at these equations that describe the universe, mathematicians will talk about there being a beauty in these equations. Now I realise not everybody will get that, and that mightn't be how you think about mathematics. In fact, if you think there's if anywhere in the neighbourhood of the talk tonight there might be an argument against God, it might be mathematics, if you think back to doing mathematics at school. But actually, when we look at the maths, again, it's really remarkable that we can use mathematics to describe the universe. And furthermore, why is it that somebody just sitting in their office doing maths, think of somebody like Peter Higgs in the 1960s trying to solve mathematical problems in particle physics, and in 2012 they carry out an experiment that finds the Higgs boson that he predicted, and he won the Nobel Prize. Why is that possible? Why is it that by sitting solving equations you can predict something about the actual universe that somebody can go out and measure? Another Nobel Prize winner, Eugene Wigner, talked about the unreasonableness of mathematics, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Again, why is the universe like this? He didn't believe in God, as far as I know, but he said that this is a miracle which we neither deserve nor understand. But you see, if you believe in God again, that makes sense of this miracle of mathematics. And also that we can study the mathematics, we can comprehend it. Because the universe is being created by an intelligent being according to a design plan. If you like, a great mathematician who has carefully designed the universe, carefully specified these laws, and has then created human beings in his image with the ability to comprehend something about the universe he's created. So, I don't know whether you're persuaded by the mathematics argument, if you like, for God's existence. As I say, that's one that maybe some of you will get and think, yes, I see that. Others think, mathematics, I'm not sure about that. But there's a further aspect to this order in nature. And this is really quite a remarkable discovery that has taken place over the last 50 years or so. And this is a discovery that basically everybody has agreed upon, that our universe is really a very special place, even more special than we'd previously thought, because it's what they call fine-tuned. Right? The idea is that there's a whole range of factors, maybe a couple of dozen factors of the universe, features of the universe that have to be exactly right for life to be possible. Exactly right for you to be here this evening. Okay? Just to give a few, and to give some idea of the numbers involved here. One concerns the balance between the gravitational and electromagnetic forces. Okay. This, according to Paul Davies, the cosmologist, has to be right to about 1 part in 10 to the power of 40. That's 1 in 10,000 trillion, trillion, trillion. So what's the explanation for that? Or take another one. The cosmological constant. This actually relates to that fudge factor that Einstein put in, but it turned out it was needed for different reasons. But again, it has to be right to something similar. 1 part, some people have estimated, in 10 to the power of 53. And Sir Roger Penrose, another Nobel Prize winning physicist and mathematician from Oxford, he has estimated that the conditions of the early universe, what's called the low entropy of the early universe, had to be right. Now you'll need to put on your mathematical thinking caps here on this one. 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. Right? So if it was just 10 to 123, this would be 1 with 123 zeros after it. Now, the question is, there's no real debate about the fine-tuning as such, that the universe, that these features of our universe have to be right. And if they were slightly different, life, as we know it, just wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be here this evening, as simple as that. So the question is, what's the best explanation of this fine-tuning? And there have been several that have been proposed. Some people have said, well, we shouldn't really be surprised. There's nothing really here to be explained. I mean, after all, if it wasn't like this, we wouldn't be here to observe what it was like. So, yeah, there's nothing to be explained. Needless to say, that hasn't got many followers, because the chances here are just far too incredible, really, to think of that. The analogy sometimes made with a firing squad, right? So you imagine that you are you've gone on a trip and things have gone bad in some country where they don't put you in prison or deport you, but you're up before the firing squad. And so you're blindfolded, and before you're blindfolded, you've seen 10 expert marksmen in front of you. And you're blindfolded, and you wait. And then you hear fire. You hear the guns go off, and to your amazement, you're still there. And you think for a minute what's going on, and you take the blindfold off, and you say, well, how did that happen? And of course, one possibility might be that you think, oh, well, really, there's not much to explain here. I mean, after all, if it all fired and hit me, I wouldn't be here to ask the question. So, really, there's nothing to explain. That doesn't seem very satisfactory. You'd really want to know, wouldn't you? And indeed, what you'd suspect is that the marksmen deliberately missed. They were on your side for some reason. It was intentional. It wasn't an accident. I mean, okay, it could be that 10 of them, just by chance, all happened to miss you. But that's not a great explanation, is it? So we need an explanation, and for something as incredible as this level of fine-tuning of our universe, we really need a very good explanation, I would say. Another possible explanation for this is that one day science will explain this. We'll have a theory of everything, and it will explain all of these examples of fine-tuning. Now, this, again, seems a bit questionable to me for a variety of reasons, and to many other people as well. So let me just give you a few very quickly. One is, well, even if that's possible, we don't know that it is. It sounds a bit like wishful thinking. I mean, okay, it might, but there's no guarantee of that. So that's not good enough to explain away the evidence for an intelligent mind. It's just something you might want to hope if you want to avoid the idea that there's a God. Secondly, the best evidence we have about theories of everything won't exactly explain the universe. It gives rise to loads of different possibilities, and so doesn't explain the fine-tuning. And lastly, the problem is that actually, if it did, then that would be an incredibly special universe that just happened to explain all of this. And so that again would push us back to think, well, how did that come about? And the final one is the idea that we live in a multiverse. That this is only one of millions, billions, perhaps even an infinite number of universes. There's another universe with an identical copy of you. There's another universe where I'm giving exactly the same talk this evening, only I've got my PowerPoint slides and I'm showing them. That's happening out there somewhere, according to some of these theories of the multiverse. Now, not all of them will say that everything happens everywhere, but some people have suggested that you might need something as bizarre as that to account for the fine-tuning. The idea would be that in each of these universes it's slightly different, and if you have enough of them, you might just somewhere have one that's got all of these different features of the universe just right for life. But I mean, that just seems incredible. And we don't have evidence for all of these other universes. Again, it seems like wishful thinking. So what I'm left with here is the idea that far and away the best explanation for this very precise nature of our universe is that there's an intelligent mind who deliberately created it this way. Okay, so we've looked at a few different pointers from science to God. We've looked at the beginning of the universe, we've looked at the order of the universe, we've looked at this fine-tuning of the universe, and we've even looked at mathematics. All I would suggest pointing to God. Now there's much more we could say here. This is nowhere near the end of the pointers we could give. We could look at the incredible order and complexity of living creatures. Look at the incredible structure within the cell and the DNA and what is required for all of the processes that go into life. We could also look at the human mind. We could look at the fact that when we try to explain this in purely physical terms, we don't even make a start. The conscious mind, I think, points us beyond a purely physical explanation. But those are arguments for another time. And people might have questions or thoughts about some of those, and we can discuss those later. That would be great. But what I'm trying to do, let's just take a little bit of a step back. The question was, has science explained God away? And so what I've tried to argue is that, first of all, there are very good reasons for thinking about the way science works, like Newton and Galileo and others thought, that science provides a basis for doing science. But then within science itself, it actually points to an intelligent creator. And there are various findings within science that I've suggested do precisely that. But there is an objection. Darwin. I mean, okay, has science explained away God? I've argued no, far from it. I think science points to God. But I've been talking about physics mostly. What about biology? Hasn't evolution explained away God? Well, how do we decide? This is a big question, isn't it? What should we think about evolution? I'm not going to answer that question, because we don't need to. Right? The reason for this is, if this is to explain away God, then we can't just assume, let's just assume for a second that a full evolutionary explanation is true, just for the sake of argument. The question remains, does that explanation also explain away? And we can't just assume that, right? That's my point from earlier in the talk. So does it? Does evolution explain away God? Does it remove the need for God? Well, you see, this is a much easier question to answer. I mean, if you want to know what we should think about evolution, you should probably get somebody else who will be much more expertise biblically and scientifically to answer that question. But I think I can answer this one about whether it explains God away. And the answer is no, it doesn't even come close. Why not? Well, evolution. It requires a physical universe, pretty obviously. So where did that come from? It requires a law-governed universe. Well, where did those laws come from? It requires a fine-tuned universe for life even to be possible at all. It requires a suitable planet orbiting a suitable star. It requires life to exist in the first place. Evolution has to have some kind of living organisms to do anything. One of the things that really amazed me when I was reading Richard Dawkins' book years ago, The God Delusion, was what he had to say about this. Because Dawkins is probably, as well as being maybe one of the foremost atheists around, what he's best known for is the idea that Darwin defeated design. He says that really before Darwin, actually belief in God and design made sense. But Darwin completely destroyed this reason for belief in God. But now here's what Dawkins says. Well, actually maybe we needed quite a dose of luck. An initial dose of luck, I think is his expression, for life to get started. And furthermore, when you go through the history of life, he talks about more sheer luck being needed. For example, to get multicellular life and to get conscious life. Sheer luck at different stages along the way. Now, if this is right, all of these things, going back to the existence of the universe, a universe that had a beginning, a universe that's ordered, a universe that's fine-tuned, a universe with a suitable star, with a suitable planet to support life, and then life to exist, requiring luck on Dawkins' part, and further doses of sheer luck along the way, well, you can begin to see why evolution, whatever we might think of it, doesn't even come close to explaining away. And we still have all of those other reasons pointing to belief in God anyway. So actually, I think evolution is a bit of a red herring in all of this. I don't think it even gets off the ground as an objection to belief in God. So what to make of all of this? There is one topic that I haven't covered yet. That was on my list earlier, and that concerns faith. Because I think, well, this is all very interesting. We could talk about physics, we could talk about biology, we could talk about the complexity of life and all of these kinds of things. And, maybe that points to some sort of intelligent creator, perhaps. Or at least I can see that that's plausible. But, so what? Interesting topic for discussion. Well, I think it's more than that. And so does Richard Dawkins. He said that whether there's a God or not, it changes everything. I mean, this totally changes the world we live in. It would be a totally different kind of place if there's a creator compared to a world without a creator. And of course it has huge repercussions for how we live. What is our purpose in life? Are we ultimately just the product of blind chance and nothing more? Or are we made in the image of God and there is a purpose that God has given for our lives? These questions are enormous because they affect how we live. And so some science is like that, some isn't. I mean, in most of the topics in cosmology and many areas of physics and other sciences too, they're fascinating topics, but you can sort of go and study them and you can come to your conclusion about which theory is best or whatever, but it doesn't really change your life. But there are other parts of science where it does. Think about climate change. Right? Climate change, given the evidence, what should we do about that? It's not just, we have all the evidence and this is impacting the climate. If that's true, and if the consequences that are specified are true, then we just can't ignore that. There's something we should do. Similarly, when it was discovered that smoking causes cancer, again, a lot of scientific studies went into trying to find out whether that's the case. Well, you don't then decide, yeah, okay, maybe it does. It's huge consequences, doesn't it? And so if Dawkins is right, this question about God's existence has huge consequences for our lives. And so faith, I would say, is not believing something in the absence of evidence, but it can be believing something on the basis of the evidence. It's acting upon that. I mean, just to illustrate the idea, if you've ever been up to the Carrick-a-Reid rope bridge, and you're going to go across, it's actually pretty safe these days, but in the past maybe not so much, and maybe looked a bit rickety, and you're standing there and you're not sure that it'll get you across, that it'll bear your weight, but you have an engineer, and the engineer checks everything and says, yeah, perfectly safe, this will bear your weight. You think, yeah, this will bear my weight, but I'm still not going across that rope bridge. It requires a step of faith. It's not a leap of faith anymore because you've got the evidence to back it up. But if this is important to you to get to the other side, then are you going to take that step on the basis of it? So I would say that when it comes to faith, faith is not something irrational, because this is what some people would think. You've got faith on the one hand and science on the other. But actually I think not only can science and God go together, but science and faith can go together. If science points us in this direction, then it's reasonable to take a step of faith. So, that's all I want to say about that topic. You might want to come back to me on some of those points. But these are the reasons, when I was exploring all of these topics years ago, that I came to the conclusion that this was, that there were plenty of good reasons for belief in God. There was certainly no reason for thinking about a conflict. And furthermore, it made perfect sense to believe in God and actually for my life to be shaped by that. And so that, I suppose, is the challenge that I give to you. I don't think it has to be proof, I'm not suggesting that, but I think it points in that direction. And so the question is, if it does, well, how significant is that for your life? And so that's maybe something that you need to process and think about. But whatever your thoughts about that, I would suggest that science doesn't present a barrier, and in fact actually presents quite a lot of pointers.